Popov came to New York in August 1941. He had a meeting with Dick Ellis and some guys from the FBI here in New York City and said, look, here is this questionnaire that I've been given by German intelligence. They want specific information about Pearl Harbor. I'm telling you that there's going to be an attack on Pearl Harbor.
Holy sh**.
And this is quite a well-known thing, and I'm actually shocked that more people don't actually look into this stuff, and that this sort of myth that the Americans didn't know about it sort of continues. FDR was warned, right, as early as August 1941, right? So
What's up, guys? If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Also, please smash that like button on the video and enjoy the show. Jesse Fink, welcome to America, sir.
nice to be here.
Thanks for stopping through. It's very cool to talk to the guy who wrote the book behind Luis Navia, Pure Narco, which I have right here, which is a phenomenal book, by the way. But we talked with Luis for like 6.5 hours or so, and his life story is insane, and you did an amazing job capturing it.
Yeah, I spent about 2.5 years talking to Lewis every day for hours on end, and really it wasn't until sort of the end of the writing process that I sort of visited him in Miami and spent a couple of weeks with him. In fact, I think it was 3 weeks. But yeah, essentially wrote the entire book at the other end of the world. He's an unusual character.
That is for sure. We're definitely going to talk about him today, just because he's one of those guys that you can't believe he actually existed, and existed as long as he did, doing what he did, and did it in the most violent business in the world. He happened to be like a not violent guy, which is so strange in many ways, but just quite a case study. And one of the things like he and I talked a lot about was the morality of how he looks at things. Like, he has a very black and white view of the world, and in some ways is extremely amoral about things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's convenient to him to think in that way. I think because he's dealing with some things that he's feeling pretty guilty about.
Sure.
I don't think you can escape kind of moral culpability for being involved in a business that thousands of people are getting killed all the time.
Sure.
You are part of that, whether or not you actually point a gun to someone's head. You are involved with violent people, and Lewis knew that for him to survive in that business, he had to have violent people around him who were going to do that kind of work. The fact that he didn't kill people personally still means that he has some sort of moral culpability for what he was involved in.
Yeah, it doesn't absolve you of the business that you're in, for sure. It's just unique. You never hear about guys who like shy away from any of that are in that business. You always hear about the dudes like cutting people up with chainsaws and.
Yeah, and the thing was, the people that I was working with, the editors, the publishers, the lawyers who were reading the manuscript, they would say to me, I'm not sensing that he's feeling remorse here. And I would say to Lewis all the time, come on, we need to show, sort of more compassion, more empathy here, some remorse. Because there is going to be an element of the readership that is going to read your story and just still think you're a prick, right? You have to show some humanity here. You need to show some contrition. And there were moments where, he had no problem showing that. There were other moments where there was a lot of bravado. He was sort of, back in business, sort of, with that sort of mentality that helped him survive for 3 decades at the top of that business. So that was a struggle, and this is the first book that I've ever done where I had to share a writing credit with someone else. even though I wrote the book, it was based on his story. So that's fair.
And he's alive while you're doing it.
And he's
It's
alive
not
while
like
I'm doing it. But there were, I had to sort of deal with situations where, I would write a sentence where I'm kind of talking about, his character, my observation of his character, and trying to show some of that sort of empathy and sort of humility and some grace. And he would read it and not be very happy with how I had interpreted him. And he said, well, if that goes in, I don't want to have anything to do with this book. Well, okay, we've got it.
How many times did he say that?
Oh, this would happen all the time. We would be screaming at each other. Sometimes at 2:00 in the morning, because it was in Sydney when I was writing this, and he had been to a bar in wherever he was, like Cuba or Key West or wherever. He had just got out of a bar. He had a bit to drink, and he was pissed off. So a lot of things were actually cut from the book because he wasn't happy with them. And also, he sees himself as a sort of a bit of a comic character.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
So when he first approached me to write this book with him, that he saw it as a sort of a Mr. Magoo of cocaine kind of tale, and obviously.
Super.
And he's very attached to that image of himself as Mr. Magoo.
Yeah.
Right? And he kept on wanting to see more of the Mr. Magoo in the manuscript. And I'm reading it and thinking, this is dark, Hey, man, you've just eaten spaghetti while someone's being tortured, in the next room. And
yeah, but the spaghetti was good. What do you want?
Yeah. So that was a real challenge for me as a writer, because I felt like the story was a lot darker than he wanted it to be.
He does, like when he walked into the restaurant the night before, I hadn't seen him before, but he walks in and he kind of looked like Francis Ford Coppola, like you would never look at this guy and say cartel member, right?
No.
He really, so I see where he's coming from with the Mr. Magoo thing, but to your point, you can't operate at those levels and be around the people like the Marios and who's the other guy? Pilo? Was that it?
Polly.
Polly. You can't operate around guys like that and not have some sort of culpability for sure. And for what it's worth, I do think the intro of your book, like I was maybe 6 pages into it, and I'm like, wow, this is starting to go long. And then about halfway through, what ended up being about halfway through the intro, I understood what you were doing. Yeah, and it was an extremely long intro because you had to not only set the scene, which is what the intro's for, but you also had to play with what you just laid out, which is your relationship with him and the difficulty in balancing all of this to write an honest book that also is something that he's going to be able to say, okay, all right, this makes sense. This is based on some truth, and it gets my story out there for better or worse regarding the parts. And I thought it was just really valuable when I finished that up because then the rest of the book, I could kind of put myself in your shoes. Like I'd be reading what you're writing, it might be heavy or whatever, and I could put myself in your shoes with, there were probably a lot of conversations about this one, and he got this one in there. I wonder which ones he wasn't able to get in there. You know?
That's right. And I had no intention of the intro being 52 pages long or whatever it is, but I was, dealing with my own sort of moral issues, obviously, in writing this book and spending all this time, documenting this guy's life, and I didn't want to glamorize him in any way. I didn't want to say, cocaine trafficking is a good thing to get into. But there are various points when I was writing, and I was thinking, wow, this guy had a great fucking life. Why didn't I do this? It sounds like a pretty good deal. You only go away for 5 years, and you
get involved for the government.
You're involved in sending out 25 tons from the Venezuelan jungle.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. There's a lot on the bone there, and I'm still figuring out, because we just recorded with Luis, which one I'm going to put out first. I'll probably put his 2 out and then
Right.
put one out with you, but
Right.
that'll be TBD. But you actually have a book that's brand new now coming out called Eagle in the Mirror. Guys, if you're still watching this video and you haven't yet hit that subscribe button, please take 2 seconds and go hit it right now. Thank you.
Yeah.
And this one I really want to dig into because I haven't had the chance to read this yet.
Yeah.
But I was pretty stunned at the synopsis of who this is and looking up this guy who is dead now, who you obviously spent a lot of time with as trying to re-piece together what was this man's life on your own, who not only was at the middle of spying at the highest levels of World War II, but was intricately involved in some ways that I was unfamiliar with in even like the creation of our CIA here in America as a guy who was supposedly MI6. This is a story that involves accusations being thrown around about his allegiances, being a double spy, triple spy, all that. But to just start it off, how did you even hear about this guy? Charles Howard Dick Ellis was his cover name, I guess, in MI6, right?
So after I finished Pure Narco, the pandemic hit the world, completely kind of wrecked the promotional campaign for Pure Narco. Lewis couldn't come out to Australia. I couldn't come to the United States. It was a disaster, really. The timing was terrible for us. And then I wanted to write another book, but I could not go anywhere. I was stuck at home. There was nothing that I could do other than essentially go to the supermarket, buy groceries, or go to thrift shops in the morning. Before I think noon. I think they just sort of stayed open.
They let the thrift shops stay open?
They let some thrift shops stay open. I guess because they're charities. Anyway, and you couldn't even sit in a cafe in Sydney. You couldn't sit at a cafe table. Yeah. It was ridiculous.
Australia was crazy with the pandemic.
It was crazy, and people couldn't play basketball, and there were literally like helicopters turning up with police.
Oh yeah,
and saying get off the fucking court, go home, and so I was spending a lot of time just sort of sitting at home. Going to thrift shops and buying CDs and old books. And my father was doing the same thing. And he called me up one day and said, Jess, by the way, look up this guy, Dick Ellis. I just bought a book and it mentions this guy called Dick Ellis. He's Australian. He was involved in espionage. He was accused of being a Nazi Soviet spy. And I was like, what? I'd never heard of the guy. The amazing thing was he actually came from the same suburb, Annandale in Sydney, where my father lives. And I thought, wow, what a story. I've never heard of this bloke. And started looking into it. And the great thing was that because of the pandemic, the National Archives in London decided to sort of make all their files downloadable for free. So while I was being stuck in Sydney, I could download thousands of files from MI5.
Is that what Andy used? He used that? Yeah. Oh, wow. So you were allowed to do that online.
So instead of paying £3.50 for every file that you downloaded, it was all free, right? So I downloaded 2,000, 3,000 files.
That'll do it.
Yeah, but they're hundreds of pages long in each file, right? And so I had so much material. I didn't have to travel to London to get the stuff. I ended up sort of basically just doing, internet research into Dick Ellis, and suddenly I had, 5,000 files on my computer, and I thought, well, this is the start of me trying to figure out who this guy was. And the thing was, it was really just a sentence at a time from whatever document, and then piecing it together with a sentence from another document, and then suddenly putting together a timeline of this guy's life, trying to figure out where he was. And suddenly I had sort of a very rough sketch of kind of his life from, 1895 in Sydney through to 1975 when he died in England. And throughout the 80 years that he was alive, he was involved in, the biggest events of the century, World War One, the Russian Civil War, World War Two, creation of the OSS, which became the CIA, the Cold War, you name it. He was involved in all these things, and he was a fascinating person because he was a self-educated Australian guy who, was born in fairly impoverished circumstances. His mother died when he was very young. His father had no money. He was sort of shuttled around sort of farms and boarding houses when he was a kid with his brother. He decided to sort of take up classical music, became a very sort of accomplished classical musician, then went off to England at the start of the First World War, enlisted in the British Army, sort of went to the Western Front, then became an expert in languages. So he ended up sort of speaking like 7 or 8 languages.
Like during the war?
Yeah, so he started studying Russian towards the end of the First World War. He was sort of picked up by the intelligence corps of the British Army for his sort of facility in Russian. He became a king's messenger for the King of England, which is like a courier, an official courier for the King of England.
Were you able to find any, I don't know if it would be any first-person stuff, but any type of research on his takeaways, his emotions, his mind state regarding World War I and what that was like being in the trenches there? Because it's kind of, when you look at history, I like to study World War I as much as I can because it's almost like the forgotten of the two. We all love studying World War II, but World War I is really what started World War II, and it was a crazy battlefield type in that war. I mean, these guys were, it was brutality at its worst.
Yeah, and he was injured like 3 times and just thrown back in every time after he recovered. So, but getting back to your question, no, it was very difficult to sort of get any kind of insight into what was going on in his mind and anything like that because he never really wrote about himself. And so there wasn't much documentation about Ellis. There were like some papers in the National Library of Australia, which included sort of a typewritten sort of piece by Ellis about his early life in Australia. So that sort of formed the basis of like the first part of the book about growing up in Australia. I couldn't have done it without those papers. But beyond that, it was very difficult to kind of get a sense of where exactly he was in the First World War. I mean, I obviously got his, military reports and things like that, but they only tell you so much. But the thing was with Ellis, he was obviously very good at languages, and that was what sort of put him in
the crosshairs of the spies.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, it put him on the sort of the radar of MI6 when he got to Oxford University. So he started studying Russian at Oxford, and he was only there for a very short time. It was about a year before he ended up being sent off to Constantinople, which is Istanbul. And his job was essentially intelligence gathering. The main enemy was obviously the Soviet Union. The Russian Revolution had happened, and obviously everyone in the West was worried that the communism was going to spread to the West. And he was sort of an expert in sort of Russian and Russian affairs, and that was really how his intelligence career started in the early 1920s. And then he was sent off to Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and all through the 30s and 40s. His main target was obviously the Soviet Union.
What kind of work is he doing at these places? Because, like, you know, we've talked with some spies on this podcast, and we've had a lot of guys come in, like yourself, and talk about different ways that espionage can occur. But you have dudes who maybe, in today's terms, maybe someone works at the State Department, but really they're there as a CIA spy. Then you have guys who drop in under an assumed name with a legend, the whole bit, and they live there and they're really working as a spy, and maybe they do a little more on the ground, like hand-to-hand type things, if you know what I mean with that. Like, what was his role in these early settings, be it in Germany and Eastern Europe, focusing on the Soviet Union and the spread of communism?
I think from what I can gather, you know, his main sort of role was, you know, sending out false information and selling of false information, sort of being involved with people who were sort of connected to the White Russian community, which is, you know, another word for essentially, you know, the Ukrainian community in Europe in the 20s and 30s, who, you know, there was a group obviously of Russian exiles who were against the communists, and he married a Ukrainian woman. He was accused of sort of selling information to the Nazis sort of through the conduit of his own brother-in-law.
Wait, what?
So his wife's brother-in-law was involved in selling information to the Nazis, right? And the question is, how much was sort of Ellis cognizant of where, you know, this information was going, and what information was it, and why was it being sold? And
that's fast forward in some years, obviously, right?
Yeah. So, but understand that this is all very vague, and I'm trying to essentially sort of explain what the substance of the charges against Ellis are. Is that he was involved in selling information about the British intelligence service to the Germans, right? And
that's what he's charged with.
What he was accused of, and. That also that at some point he was sort of compromised, and then sort of ended up sort of working for the Soviets as well, right? There's not much evidence against him in both regards. In fact, there's nothing to show that he was a Soviet agent at any time. There is some sort of evidence to show that he was involved in the trading of information with the Nazis, but you know, you got to remember sort of. Prior to the Second World War, there was a degree of cooperation between the British and the Germans against their common enemy, which was at the time was the Soviet Union, right? So, and that's a story that really hasn't really been explored that much, sort of, as far as I know, and from what I've read in sort of history books, is the cooperation between the British and the Germans.
Yeah,
in the early 30s, you know, after sort of Hitler came to power, and obviously people know about appeasement and Neville Chamberlain and everything else, but there was a lot of, you know, sort of fairly dark shit going on in the intelligence services of Britain and Germany against the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and I mean, in all honesty, in America, we had some of that problem too with the guys who later formed OSS and CIA. Absolutely.
Yeah. So my feeling, my takeaway from doing the research and what Ellis was accused of was that he was essentially being instructed by his bosses at MI6 to trade information with the Nazis. And what happened was that at some point he possibly received some sort of money. Now, I don't know what the circumstances are. It cannot be proven what the circumstances were, but at some point there's this allegation that he sort of received money for some information. But, you know, as you know, you've probably looked into, you know, other intelligence stories. You know, intelligence is not a sort of a straightforward business, and you're involved in some fairly kind of morally sort of compromising situations. And I think that whatever he was doing, there was no sort of bad intentions, or there was no sort of nefarious kind of plan to undermine his own intelligence service. I think he was involved just in doing something that MI6 wanted him to do, but it wasn't for the knowledge of anyone else. And then what happened was that after Kim Philby defected to the Soviet Union in 1963, it only took 2 years for Ellis to be hauled into an interrogation room in London, where he was grilled by a sort of a joint committee of MI5 and MI6 officers about why his name was appearing in these interrogation reports of Nazis that had been interviewed after the war. So obviously what happened when Kim Philby defected was they went back to all their archives, they went through all their interrogation reports of Nazis, and they found, who's this Captain Ellis that's supposedly selling information to these German officers? Why do these German officers know this guy called Captain Ellis? Who could that be? And the interesting thing was that one of these reports crossed the desk of Kim Philby, who in 1946 was still working for MI6.
Yeah, so just for context for people out there, I'm going to have you explain this if you don't mind, but Kim Philby was one of the reputed Cambridge 4, Cambridge 5, whatever it was.
Cambridge 5.
And became the highest ranking MI6 member to ever be revealed as a
Soviet
spy, in this case a Soviet spy. But can you just explain the background of how he was revealed and the defection and all that, just so that people understand?
Well, he was under suspicion really from the early 1950s. And he denied that he was a Russian spy, and it wasn't until 1963 that he was in Beirut in Lebanon, and actually sort of escaped in the middle of the night and ended up in Russia, and suddenly, we've got this massive high-level defection. It's embarrassed the intelligence services of Britain and the United States and Canada and all the other sort of Western intelligence agencies. And what happened was that then there was suddenly a big witch hunt within MI6, MI5, the CIA, to find other sort of possible Soviet moles, right? So they went back over all the sort of the interrogation reports of Nazis, and this is where Ellis's name came up. And going back to 1946, when no one was suspecting Kim Philby, one of these reports went across Kim Philby's desk. Someone said to him, do you have any idea who this guy Ellis might be? And he said, I have no idea who this person is. No further action. Right?
Ellis or Ellie?
Sorry?
Ellis or Ellie?
Ellis.
So actually him.
Yeah, Ellis. Okay. Captain Ellis, right? And but I'll get on to it. There is another Ellie, but I'll talk about that later.
Right.
But Philby wrote, no further action. Even though Ellis and Philby basically sort of shared office space, right? It was a very sort of odd thing for Philby to do. So in the context of the 1960s, something like that looks very odd.
Sure.
And that was really why kind of Ellis fell under suspicion that a Philby might be protecting Ellis, or might have been protecting Ellis at that time, and that Ellis in 1946 could have been a Soviet spy.
And there were the others who were the Cambridge 4 or 5, whatever it was, who were uncovered to actually be Soviet spies who were associated with
they've all been exposed eventually, yes,
Yep.
into the 1970s and so on. But at the time, in 1963, Philby was obviously the big one, and everyone was shitting themselves because, like, how did this person operate under our noses right. for so long, and for us, not to have any idea, and it caused great embarrassment in the United States and Great Britain, and so Ellis was hauled into an interrogation in 1965, and confronted with sort of allegations that had been made that he had sort of sold all this information to the Nazis and that he was responsible for all these terrible things that had happened, where people had died, and he denied that he'd ever been a Soviet spy. He supposedly sort of said, yes, I had passed information on to the Nazis. But the information that we know about what he confessed to has only ever sort of come up in the book Spycatcher, which came out in 1987, which was this mega best-selling book that went around the world by Peter Wright. A book by Chapman Pincher called Their Trade is Treachery, for which Peter Wright, who wrote Spycatcher, was the main source. And books by a guy called Nigel West, who was a well-known espionage author. And, West had his own sources for his case against Ellis. But none of these things have ever been proven. They're all very, very circumstantial. And I think, they've drawn a very long bow to kind of accuse Ellis of being a Nazi and Soviet spy. There's no evidence whatsoever that he was a Soviet spy.
And it also, like, that in and of itself, it's not to say there weren't guys who didn't end up having trails go back to both, but again, the Nazis and Soviets, as you laid out earlier, didn't like each other. You had opposite ends in that spectrum in that respect. You had fascism and you had communism. So it seems like, we had our McCarthy witch hunt here in America.
Yeah.
This was kind of like the post-Philby witch hunt, where perhaps, yes, there were obviously leaks. There were guys who were part of this. That's been proven in many ways for some of these other guys. But does that mean that all the people they're accusing, including like Dick Ellis, therefore, have to be one of the things that quacks like a duck here?
Yeah, but don't forget, not every Nazi was a fan of Adolf Hitler either, right? So, you've seen Valkyrie.
Yep.
And about Canaris and all the plotters against Hitler, Stauffenberg and so on.
Yep.
There was a core of officers who were against Hitler. Now, so the idea of a British intelligence officer having sort of some sort of cooperation with sort of Nazi officers who were against Adolf Hitler kind of makes sense,
yes.
right? So there are all different ways that you can interpret a British intelligence officer having some sort of communication with Nazis. You can see it in a very sort of dark light. You can see it in that light, right? We don't know exactly what the true information is because his supposed confession has never been published.
Right.
We don't know exactly what was in it. We're only going on the say-so of Peter Wright, who wrote this book Spycatcher, which essentially he wrote to make money. He was broke and living on the bones of his ass in Tasmania, right? He had to have a juicy story. So he came up with this story about Dick Ellis. So anyway, the point is, I went through all these documents, these thousands of documents, went over and looked at the specific allegations that were made against Dick Ellis and came to the conclusion at the end of it that there really wasn't much to pin on him and that you really have to give him the benefit of the doubt. And that if he had been, the spy that he was accused of being for the greatest enemies that the West ever had, there are other things that he would have, given up to the Russians and the Germans. There's plenty of things that he could have given up to Germany and the Russians, and he didn't. Why would he sort of be given the Legion of Merit by Harry S. Truman in 1946 for his contribution to the American war effort? Why would he sort of be appointed sort of head of MI6 in the Far East and North America, post-war, if there was any sort of doubt about...
Well, at the time, I'm playing devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
Not that I disagree with your overall takeaway, but at the time, Kim Philby got really high up because people thought he was fine, right?
Yeah.
So Dick Ellis could get, let's say he wasn't, Dick Ellis could get up really high because people think he's fine. They think he's a good spy, and then suddenly one day they're like, "Oh, he's not."
Yeah, but the thing is, in 1946, if this mention of Captain Ellis in this Nazi officer's interrogation report is appearing in a document, Kim Philby's not the only one who would have seen that document.
Sure.
So suspicions really could have been raised about Ellis as early as 1946. Anyway, and it wasn't until 1965 that he was called in and asked to explain, why are these Nazi officers sort of mentioning this Captain Ellis as a source of information.
Did you have a chance to talk with any of his surviving family in making this book?
No, and the only contact I had was with his granddaughter, who lives in New York City, I believe, and Ellis's daughter lives in New York City, but his granddaughter wouldn't give me any access to his daughter. So because they had sort of been, or they felt that they had been let down by other writers who had wanted to write anything about Ellis, and they were very upset about the way that Ellis had been treated. His daughter had sort of returned all his medals to the British government after he had been accused of these things. And he died in 1975, sort of with this big cloud over his life, his achievements, his reputation. He died basically broke. And, for Ellis, it would have been, a bitter pill, to see if he had been alive, the success of A Man Called Intrepid, which came out, 1 year after Dick Ellis died.
Yeah, this is a book we have up on the screen right now.
Which went on to sell 8 million copies and became this mega smash around the world, and had a it was turned into a movie with David Niven. So, and
Dick talked all about him.
And Dick Ellis actually wrote the foreword for this book, before he died, right? So Dick Ellis is mentioned in A Man Called Intrepid, but he doesn't really appear in the book itself except under the code name Howard. So he was, it's a bit of a clue. I mean, obviously, the code names they use aren't particularly sort of clever. And the other thing is, you asked before about Ellie. There was actually there's this Russian spy whose code name is Ellie, who they've never actually uncovered.
Even today.
They don't know who it is.
Whoa.
So other than Kim Philby, this Ellie is the most significant Russian spy that ever lived.
And what was his? So let's go down that for a second. The Ellie, what was his? Obviously, they, in some form of intelligence, had been able to gather what his code name was, but what was his calling card as a spy? What made him so disastrous as a mole?
Well, there was a guy called Igor Gasenko who defected, and he said, but basically, there's this guy called Ellie. He's been under your noses all along. He is the most penetrative sort of agent that Russia's ever had, and what happened was that basically with the agencies of the United States and the UK and sort of this, there we go, Igor Gasenko, in this lather about how Philby had managed to get away with it for such a long time. Ellie was the biggest of them all, and so much has sort of been written about Ellie, and people have spent their whole lives trying to figure out who he is, and there's a question about whether he's actually real or not, and it was just a lie. But having written this book, I mean, it's such a complicated story. I don't know if I'm explaining it very well, but
no, you're doing a good job.
But there are so many strands to it. It really is, getting into an espionage book, there's so many sort of rabbit holes that you can go down, and it's a bit of a mind fuck, really. And you don't know what's real and what isn't real. And it's, the old wilderness of mirrors.
Well, you said you started with like 5,000 documents, something like that,
Yeah.
4,000 or 5,000 documents, and they're all 100-page or hundreds of pages long. What was the most common type of document you were reviewing? Like individual case files, communications internally that have been declassified? What types of things were in there? You're good. Don't worry about it.
Mostly they were interrogation reports of Nazis who had been interviewed after the end of the war, and it was a real struggle, really, I guess, to find the information I was looking for, because so many of these files are very faded, hardly legible. It's not like you can sort of run sort of a software program and get it to,
Right.
copy the text in the document. You actually have to read the thing yourself and type it out yourself. And I'm looking for any kind of mention of Ellis in all of these hundreds of interrogation reports of these Nazis. And there was one that I had to pay for. I had to spend £200. It was one that hadn't been digitized, so I'm literally paying £200. What's that in American dollars?
Fairly similar. Yeah. Right now, the pound trades for more, right? Yeah. I haven't looked at that in a while. I'm not on Wall Street anymore.
A lot of money, like $300 American or something, right? For this 200-page file about this guy called Vladimir von Petrov, who was this Chilean German agent who was interrogated in Santiago in 1956. And supposedly, Dick Ellis was mentioned in this file, and it's all in Spanish. And
so you got it translated too?
Oh, no, no, but there was no mention of Ellis in it whatsoever, except for one page where someone had written in pen.
Can you get your money back for that?
Written in pen, Ellis, ? And that was it, right? And so there was nothing in this entire thing. It was like, oh shit, that was a bit of a waste of money. But this is the nature of what you're doing. You're just trying to piece together this guy's life.
You're chasing a ghost in a lot of ways.
Yes, and so Dick Ellis made this massive contribution to Western intelligence, particularly in the early 1940s when he came to New York, when he wrote the blueprint for the OSS, with what became the CIA.
Yeah, this is the mindfuck part. If you don't mind, I'd really like to dig into this.
Yeah.
Like, you were telling me before, if I understood this correctly, this was right before we went on camera, that Britain had an office, I forget what it was called, in the United States in New York City that was essentially to try to get America into the war. I guess this is in like the late 30s. Like 39, 40, something like that?
1940, 41, 42. So, and it sort of ran through to, it kind of sort of disbanded really after Pearl Harbor happened. And Dick Ellis is important in regard to Pearl Harbor.
Oh, really?
Yes. So, and this is probably the biggest bit of dynamite in the book, really, that, Ellis came out. He was the deputy to William Stevenson at British Security Coordination, which was this MI6 agency that had been set up in New York, essentially to get the United States into the war. It was basically monitoring sort of Nazi activity in the United States, sort of pumping out its own propaganda and so on. But the raison d'etre of this organization was to get the United States into the war. Right, and there was an agent. I don't know if you've heard of him, called Dusko Popov.
Yeah, like the Popov's mole thing that John Newman talks about, I think, Alessi. Yeah.
Popov has been sort of held up as the model for James Bond. He was this sort of Serbian playboy
Can you just stay like
Sorry.
facing this just because the camera's here?
Sorry, he was this Serbian. There we go, Dusko Popov. He's regarded as the main sort of inspiration for James Bond. And Popov was a German agent, but he was also working for the British. And Popov came to the United States, and he had been requested to find out information about Pearl Harbor for the Germans, for the German intelligence service, basically on behalf of the Japanese. So the Japanese were interested in Pearl Harbor. So his job was to come to the United States, gather as much information about Pearl Harbor as possible. This was like in December 1941 was Pearl Harbor, right? December the 7th.
Yep.
Right. Popov came to New York in August 1941. He had a meeting with Dick Ellis and some guys from the FBI here in New York City and said, look, here is this questionnaire that I've been given by German intelligence. They want specific information about Pearl Harbor. I'm telling you that there's going to be an attack on Pearl Harbor.
Holy shit.
Yes. And this is quite a well-known thing, and I'm actually shocked that more people don't actually look into this stuff, and that this sort of myth that the Americans didn't know about it sort of continues to this day, and that FDR didn't know anything about it. Because from what I read and from what Ellis said, FDR was warned, right, as early as August 1941. Right, so Popov came to New York. He had this meeting with Dick Ellis, who he was his minder here in New York.
His minder?
His minder, like, just a guy to hang out with and show him around and, pick him up at the hotel and so on. And these guys from the FBI, right? And he essentially said, look, this is the questionnaire. This is something that you should be looking into, and you should be very concerned about it. And then supposedly, and this has always sort of been denied by various people sort of who cling to this idea that that the Americans didn't know about Pearl Harbor, but that sorry. Sorry, that Popov had a meeting with Hoover, right?
Directly with him.
Directly, and that this has been denied, and that, but Popov wrote in his autobiography that he had a meeting with Hoover, that he sort of warned him about Pearl Harbor, and Hoover ejected Popov from this meeting and said, piss off, I don't want to have anything to do with you, just get out, and so Popov writes about this in his autobiography. It's a well-known story, and that that the story goes that FDR, that Hoover knew nothing about Pearl Harbor before it happened, right? But Popov maintained in his autobiography that the Americans were warned, that they knew about it, and that they chose to do nothing. So what was interesting to me while in the course of researching this book was that I came across a transcript of an interview that Dick Ellis had done with a Canadian documentary crew back in the 70s when they were thinking about doing a documentary about the life of William Stevenson, a man called Intrepid. And
he was the head of the desk in New York for Britain?
He was the head of the British Security Coordination.
Right.
And Stevenson is regarded as a war hero in Canada and the United States. There's parks named after him in Canada, and he's regarded as a national hero in Canada. And anyway, Ellis was interviewed by this program about Stevenson, and he was asked about Pearl Harbor, and he said that that the Americans were warned that Stevenson warned FDR that Ellis and Stevenson together had basically got a message to the President of the United States through his brother, Jimmy Roosevelt. Jimmy Roosevelt. Can you just get that up?
Okay, can we look that up, Alessi? So there was some sort of message that went through him, so it didn't go directly.
Sorry, so not his brother, his son.
James.
Jimmy Roosevelt.
This one? No.
Or would it have been... Who was the other...
there we go. Franklin D.
This
Roosevelt's
is the right
son.
guy?
Yeah.
Okay.
That a message had got to a message had got to the president through Jimmy Roosevelt that Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked. Now, I don't know exactly why it had to go through Jimmy Roosevelt, but the substance of what Ellis was saying was that we got a message to FDR that Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked, right? So that's separate to the warning that Popov gave Hoover.
So multiple streams.
Multiple streams, right? So this is confirmation that Ellis and Stevenson had got a message to the President of the United States, right? So that goes against the prevailing narrative that the Americans knew nothing about it.
Question. Could there have been... You know, in these worlds, obviously, a lot of information flows where there's information that's purposely sent to beat disinformation, to draw people offside or things like that. Could there have been some sort of situation like that, given that there were so many potential targets that could have been attacked in the United States in something like this?
And that's a valid interpretation because that's probably what Hoover thought of Dusko Popov. He's like, and why should I trust anything that you're telling me? You work for the Germans, right? While you're also working for the British. But, you know, you could be a Nazi spy and I don't know any better. So get out of my fucking office, right? Which is essentially what Hoover said to Popov, right? But if Ellis and William Stevenson were independently warning the President of the United States that there was going to be an attack on Pearl Harbor, that's a different matter entirely. Because Ellis and Stevenson were well respected in Washington. You know, they were operating at the highest levels of the United States intelligence security apparatus at that time.
What year did Ellis arrive in the United States?
1940.
Okay. And he went right to work for this office in New York. So prior to coming here, if we could step back for a minute, just size some context. You had mentioned a while ago, obviously, there had been questions that later came up about him trading information with Nazis. The timeline there sounded like it would have been more like 1934, 1935 to me. Is that about right?
Yes, but the weird thing is that a lot of the sort of the timeline would suggest that these charges against Ellis would have been sort of happening at around 1926, but the Nazis weren't even in power at that time, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of the timelines don't actually work when you look at the actual accusations made against him.
So wait, you're saying that when they were making accusations in, say, 1965, when they were questioning him, they were literally, it's on record, they were saying like, oh, you were trading information with Nazis in 1926?
Well, it was saying that, oh, when you were in Berlin, you were, trading information with the Nazis when you were in Berlin. But if you look at where Ellis was at any particular time between the 20s and 30s, he was stationed in Berlin from 1923 to 1926. He went to...
It's when Hitler was in prison.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Right. And from 1931 to 39, he was living in London. Right?
Now, could he have been visiting, though?
Yes, of course he could have been visiting. Yeah. So you can't prove that he didn't sort of turn up and spend several weeks or whatever in Berlin, and all these things could have happened at that time. But, he was sending his kids to school in England. He was a member of the sort of Royal Geographical Society. So all these things can be proven, that he was in London. He had addresses in London. I've got all the addresses of him in London. He was living in London.
Right.
So if he was up to all this sort of bad shit in Berlin, I don't know when he was doing it. There is a record of him being in Berlin in 1932, but the Nazis came to power, what, in 1933, right? Yeah. So there's a big question mark over exactly what he's accused of, and what the evidence is suggesting is that it just doesn't stack up.
What was he doing? What was his role when he was in London from 31 to 39? Do we know like what types of desks he was working or what his titles were?
I don't know exactly what his title. I wouldn't say that he had a title or anything like that. But he at the end of the 30s, he was involved in the sort of the tapping of phone lines from the German embassy to Berlin. And there was a suggestion that he had sort of passed on this information to the Nazis as well, that the MI6 was onto the telephone lines and were intercepting the calls, between von Ribbentrop and Hitler.
So he was at the front of that potentially.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you said he comes to the U.S. in 1940, and you had said that in this time period he was dynamite in the eyes of some of the highest people in the U.S. So in the 30s, just because sometimes I get a little lost in this history, like the OSS really formed coming into World War II as the Americans' heartbeat center for intelligence. But prior to that, some of these guys, be it Wild Bill Donovan, I think Dulles was back working on as a Wall Street lawyer at the time, but like some of the guys who were deep government kind of spies in the United States, where were they operating out of? Like what was MI6's communication, I guess, like go-between with the United States in the late 30s?
Sorry, so explain it again. Sorry.
So MI6 eventually had a partner with OSS.
Yeah.
Right? Prior to OSS existing, who did MI6 talk to? Like you mentioned the FBI, but we don't think about them as this international spy organization. They're domestic police more.
Well, the predecessor of the OSS was coordinator of information. That was the body that existed before the establishment of the OSS. But Ellis essentially was the person who was doing all the work, and he was sort of talking to Donovan really as early as the early 1940s. And if you read the book, I've got multiple quotes from people who were very high up in the OSS and the American government, at sort of Assistant Secretary of State level to the head of the OSS in Europe, saying the person who was really running the OSS was Dick Ellis. It wasn't William Donovan.
Running it?
Running it. Right?
How so?
You tell me. I don't know.
That's a crazy. That's a wild claim.
It's a big statement. But if you read the book, you'll see. He not only was involved in sort of writing a blueprint for the setting up of an intelligence organization in the United States, which is on paper, it's provable. He was has been credited with sort of setting up training camps for OSS personnel in the United States, for setting up Camp X in Canada.
Camp X?
Camp X was like this sort of a training camp for OSS personnel. All these sort of remarkable things, and the crazy thing is, who is Dick Ellis? Who is this person that no one knows about?
British guy too, doing it.
Well, Australian.
Yeah.
I'm very parochial.
Right. Represent Britain, though. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But he always sort of regarded himself as British. So But obviously, when I first wrote the book, my Australian publisher was super interested in it because it was like this untold Australian story, and I think it's just sort of crazy that this classical musician who spoke 8 languages was sort of running an American intelligence service. in the early 1940s, and that we know nothing about it. So that's where that was really the starting point for me. Who the fuck is this guy?
And once the U.S. got in the war, though, in 1942, after Pearl Harbor happened in December 41, what became of that office in New York? Like, so it sounds to me like that's when perhaps this office was then used to help spin up what became the OSS. Is that pretty much what it was?
So what became of
the office in New York that was in charge with trying to get the U.S. into the war?
British Security Coordination. Yeah, it was essentially disbanded after Pearl Harbor. They, got their marching orders, and Hoover didn't want the British operating in New York anymore.
Hey guys, if you have a second, please be sure to share this episode around on social media and with your friends, whether it's Reddit, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, doesn't matter. It's all a huge help. It gets new eyeballs on the show, and it allows us to grow and survive. So thank you to all of you who have already been doing that, and thank you to all of you who are going to do so now.
But getting back to, this Pearl Harbor accusation, there's actually a quote in the book from Roald Dahl, the children's
the writer,
the children's book author, who was a BSC agent, who
I didn't know that.
Also corroborates the Ellis Stevenson story that FDR was warned.
Whoa, Roald Dahl.
Roald Dahl.
There's a throwback.
Yeah. So there was a group of pretty interesting people working for BSC, including the playwright Noel Coward, Roald Dahl, some fascinating people. And so you got Stevenson, Ellis, and Roald Dahl saying FDR was warned. Now, I don't know why this hasn't sort of been more of a thing, but, if you go and read about sort of Pearl Harbor on Wikipedia and things like that, this whole idea of FDR being warned is sort of dismissed as a conspiracy theory.
They usually are.
Yeah. But here you have someone like Dick Ellis, who is well credentialed, who was well respected, saying something that goes against the prevailing narrative that we've all been led to believe. Why was Dick Ellis discredited as much as he was? That you could interpret that in a way. It's like, well, okay, we need to take out this guy.
Right.
He said too much.
He's saying something that's
if you're conspiratorially inclined, it's a very sort of easy thing to do.
Yeah, when you're in a situation like that, I think about that often. It's like you're in a lose-lose-lose if you're the government. Because if you say, well, yeah, we did get warned, but it wasn't a conspiracy, we just fucked up. Well, now you all look like complete imbeciles to history. But if you say, yeah, it's a conspiracy and it was real because we let it happen, well, now you look like, false flag crazy people. You can't really win. So it's amazing that something that happened, over 80 years ago at this point is still kind of policed that way. But it's a central part of not only U.S. history, but world history. It's like if we don't get into the war there, maybe war doesn't turn out how it is and we're all speaking German right now.
Yeah.
It's a real thought.
But, also what were the advantages of America getting into the war? There are many reasons to get into the war.
And what would you say those were?
Well, a war economy. I mean, look, why did people get into wars? Why did the Americans invade Iraq?
Yep.
Right? The military-industrial complex. It's a great employer. It creates industries. It bankrolls an economy. So there are all sorts of reasons to get involved in a war. But anyway, these are questions I can't answer. All I could do really around this sort of Pearl Harbor thing is kind of just report what Dick Ellis said, and I thought it was pretty fascinating, really, and it sort of warranted further investigation.
So even though the office was disbanded, he remained in the U.S. for a couple of years, right?
That's right.
He didn't leave till like D-Day 44, something like that?
He left in 1944.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it was during this time where he's setting up like Camp X and all that stuff you'd already laid out.
Yeah, he was more involved sort of, I guess, over the border in Canada and with Camp X and stuff.
Okay.
And then he goes back to England and then he's sent out to Asia, he sort of runs the Far East office for MI6. He's
After the war?
Yeah, after the war. So he's sort of he's out in Asia. He sort of sets up the Australian intelligence services for the Australian government, and then the 50s, 60s. It's sort of fairly quiet, really, and then it sort of all blows up in 1965. In 1963 when Kim Philby defects. And then suddenly, within 18 months or whatever it is, Ellis is hauled into an interrogation room in London and sort of confronted with all these reports of these Nazis being interrogated in the 40s who mentioned this guy, Captain Ellis.
Yeah. And he's still working actively at that point in MI6.
Well, the most interesting thing is that he was actually employed to work in the library of MI6 and weed the files. So at the same time, yes, right? So why are you entrusting someone who's sort of under this cloud of suspicion with actually going into your library and throwing out files we don't need anymore? It doesn't.
Very convenient.
But yes, you could look at it that way, or you could look at it and say, well, maybe they trusted this guy. And the fact is
That's what I think.
Various heads of MI6 still held Ellis in very high regard. And so even at his funeral in 1975, the head of MI6 at the time, a guy called Morris Oldfield, was there, and he slipped a note to his Ellis's daughter and said, if there's anything you need, get in touch with me. If they really thought that Ellis was a Soviet spy, they wouldn't be doing that. They wouldn't have anything to do with the family or the funeral, so they wouldn't be sending Ellis a birthday card just before he died.
Yeah. There's a lot.
It's very strange. So I think my feeling is, having done all this sort of work to piece together Ellis's life, that Ellis took the fall for MI6. MI6 was involved in something that they didn't want anyone to know about. And I think that it incriminated Ellis's bosses at MI6, who were still alive at that time in 1965. So he was. I genuinely think that on the basis of all the things that I've put together in that book, which are very complex and very detailed, and I can't adequately explain everything that's in this book here sitting with you now, but there was nothing to suggest that Ellis was anything but a loyalist to his country.
Well, there's also more history beyond just MI6 here with looking this way. Like you pointed out, there's the famous story about appeasement with Neville Chamberlain. But before then, which is really what we're talking about, there literally was, some coordination between Nazis and the UK and maybe the US as well. I know there's some evidence of that because, they're fighting against the Soviets. But to me, looking at it, it all kind of starts at the top. And one of the most embarrassing moments in 20th century British history was when King Edward VIII was revealed to have ties to Hitler and Germany. Because essentially, I guess, he abdicated the throne in 1936. 1937, he's living in France in some ways in disgrace because he had left behind his throne, but he was writing and coordinating with Adolf Hitler and leadership of the Nazi Party, eventually ended up visiting Germany in 1937, and there were pictures of him, in addition to his correspondence, found, giving the salute, shaking hands with Hitler, with his wife, Wallis Simpson, and there had been discussions of potentially, if Hitler were able to take England, that he would return King Edward VIII to the throne, because the only reason he had left is because he fell in love with this American divorcee, and the Church of England wouldn't let it happen, so he left the throne. But, this didn't come out till years later and was something that, Britain was obviously very, very embarrassed about. So when you kind of add that to the appeasement problem that partially got us into this war by letting Hitler do whatever the hell he wanted, to oh my God, there was even some intelligence before we really knew how bad this was in 34, 35, where, we're working with them. That might just be, in the eyes of PRville, a bridge too far, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Fair to say?
Yeah, fair to say. And I think this whole the relationship between the British and the Nazis, sort of in the mid-30s, is a fascinating part of history that really hasn't been investigated enough. And I do remember, one historian who had read my book sort of contacted me after it came out, and he said, that is really sort of the blank part of the story. That's the part of the story that is the hardest thing for any writer to kind of put together, but it's probably the most interesting kind of thing you could be looking at right now, is what was the nature of the relationship between the British government and the Nazi Germany in the mid 1930s.
You gonna write that book?
No.
I think you should. You're right on it.
Too hard.
Too hard.
That's too hard.
You've written some pretty hard stories here. You don't want to take that one?
Yeah, but look, that book's only 350 pages long, and that took me 3 years or whatever to write, and I've got to survive while writing these books. If someone was to give me $500,000 advance, I'd happily do it. If I had
might need to figure that out.
7-8 years to write this thing. Because these things take an inordinate amount of time.
Absolutely.
But the thing was, at the end of the day, I just felt like, after my father had suggested sort of writing Ellis's story, and I started looking into it, and I saw his sort of crappy Wikipedia entry, and I thought, I owe it to this guy to kind of make an effort to kind of put his life together.
Can we pull up his Wikipedia? I'm curious to see how they put it. I haven't read his Wikipedia.
Oh, it's good now. But when I first
they changed it.
Yeah. It's sort of covers a lot of kind of what's in the book now. But when I first started working on the book, it was very brief.
Interesting.
So, it sort of covers now, really the things that have come out in the book, and
so they're using a lot of yours. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you go now, Alessi, real fast? Go down on the page. I just want to see some. Keep going. All right. So this is very extensive now.
Yeah.
And they're citing a lot of what you found.
Yeah.
Now that's kind of cool. So you got something into the official record, if you will. The official online record.
Yeah, but
to change the narrative a little bit.
Yeah, but really, I felt like I owed it to sort of Dick Ellis to try and write his story, to have an open mind about whether he was innocent or not, and I certainly didn't sort of go into it sort of with any kind of idea about how it was going to end or anything like that. I had a very open mind about it. Yeah, and really, by the end of it, I thought, well, no, it just doesn't stack up. And really, if he was involved in what he was involved in, quite aside from the allegations that were made against him, having served the British in the First World War, be a decorated war hero in the Second World War, set up the the intelligence service of Australia and the United States. You're a remarkable person. Not only that, he wrote a book on the League of Nations.
He wrote a book on the League of Nations?
He wrote a very respected book on the League of Nations when he was an agent in Geneva in 1927.
So an active agent wrote a book. That's really cool.
He wrote a 600-page book.
600 pages? We got to get you to do 600 pages on this period. Come on now.
So not only did he do that, he was a scholar of Central Asia. He was sort of an active anti-communist, right through to the early 1970s. He was a remarkable guy.
Man of many talents.
A man of many talents, and why don't we know about him? Because no one had attempted to write his story. So, stupidly, I just decided I was going to be the person to do it. And
here we are.
Here we are. talking about it.
What did he have to say about the League of Nations? For people out there, that was what ended up being a predecessor to the UN, but it failed, where the United States, Woodrow Wilson invented the idea. A bunch of the allies after World War I joined it, but Woodrow Wilson had political enemies in the United States, and so Congress didn't pass it, so the U.S. never joined it, and then World War II happened, so it obviously didn't work. But he's writing this in 1927, so this is when a lot of the European countries are in it. It's active. Supposedly, it's kind of working. What did he have to say about it?
Well, it's hard work to read, and I wouldn't recommend anyone read it because it's written in very dry sort of prose. But the biggest takeaway from it was that Ellis was above all else, he wanted peace. He wanted peace between all nations, and he very, very obviously regarded the Soviet Union as the biggest threat to world peace, and that's all through that book.
The same guy who ends up being accused of being a Soviet spy.
Yeah, exactly. Right, so it doesn't make any sense, and so he's writing anti-communist kind of pieces. Academic papers, anti-communist pamphlets, all through the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. So the idea that he was a Soviet spy is completely preposterous.
Well, let's play devil's advocate for a second. I tend to agree with that. But let's say he's writing the book in 1927, and he really is actually anti-communist and anti-Soviet, and probably harbors that feeling politically throughout his life. It's not like that changes. But in the 50s, 60s, let's say he had been turned, it would be a part of keeping the cover to be able to continue writing like you had in the past.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the things that I often find myself forgetting about when I'm studying different guys who have flipped in the past and the whole Cold War and what went on there is that sometimes guys who became spies for the Soviet Union, they didn't do it because of the ideology. In fact, they may have hated the ideology. But, they got caught with their pants down in the wrong place, or, their wife left them and they had no money and they weren't seeing their kids. And, Mr. KGB comes in and says, we take care of this problem for you. And now suddenly, boom, I'm on Team Soviet. So is it possible, again, your takeaway is your takeaway, and I tend to agree with you. I think this guy had a pretty distinguished career. But is it possible that someone like this could have had a blind spot somewhere that was seized upon?
Yeah, absolutely possible. But this guy had no money at the end of his life. He was financially struggling. If I really believe that if he was in the employ of the Soviet intelligence services, the KGB,
Would have had more.
He would have had more. He wouldn't be struggling. He couldn't even, pay his club memberships in London. He could hardly afford clothing. The book, A Man Called Intrepid, sort of started off as a manuscript that Ellis wrote himself. So he was sort of.
What do you mean?
Well, basically, he wrote a bunch of manuscripts about British security coordination that were rejected. Stevenson sort of asked him to sort of write an early manuscript about the work of British security coordination. It was rejected. Another book came out in the 60s called The Quiet Canadian, and then Ellis's manuscript was kind of used really as the basis for what became A Man Called Intrepid, but Ellis never saw the money. But just going back to the Wikipedia page, if you scroll up, if you go down a bit, and there's a painting.
Down some more.
So
right there.
Yeah. So there's a famous painting.
Isaac Brodsky's The Execution of the 26 Baku Commissars.
Yeah, which was this incident in what is now Turkmenistan, which was then Transcaspia, where Ellis was actually accused of being one of these British officers that had been painted here, who were witness to the execution of these 26 communists by a railroad, and it was a big deal at the time. It was turned into a very big deal by Stalin, and there was a man called Reginald Teague Jones who is also supposedly one of the British officers in this picture, who Stalin sort of personally held responsible for what had happened. And Teague Jones ended up changing his name to Ronald Sinclair, and spent the rest of his life under this fake name because he was so worried that he was going to get assassinated by Soviet agents.
What year again was this?
This was, this was 1918.
Oh, so this is right as the revolution has gone underway.
Yeah, that's right. So this was right at the end of and so when did Stalin come into power?
Stalin would have been like the
Stalin
30s, I think, right? Like 32, maybe 31.
No, I think it was earlier than that.
Might have been early. Was he 20? Let's check that, Leslie. Was he all the way back at 23 or 24?
No, it was around the early 20s.
1922.
Yeah.
Oh shit! Yeah,
that's
wow.
right. And
that man was there for a while.
He was there for a while. Died in 53, right?
Yep.
And so Stalin held Reginald Teague Jones responsible for the massacre of these communists. And so the question is, if Ellis was really a Soviet spy, why wouldn't he give up one of his best mates to the Soviets, who were, dispatching people all over the world? Assassins were going out killing people all over the world. There were, the great purges of the late 30s that Stalin was involved in.
Yep.
And Reginald Teague Jones, under the name Ronald Sinclair, and actually ended up becoming vice consul to Dick Ellis in New York City.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay. So that would be
in the early 40s, right?
He's literally working right next to him, and then he'd
Exactly.
be a Soviet spy working next to a dude to execute. Yeah.
If you're a Soviet spy, why wouldn't you give up your best mate to Joseph Stalin, who was then very much alive
and very much bloodthirsty for any type of revenge?
Exactly. So it doesn't make any sense.
So, this whole thing though, because this is a part of your reporting, looking at this era politically and how communism shaped so much before World War II that then obviously got blown mainstream after World War II once Hitler was gone. But like this guy, Ryan Chapman, who is a great researcher on YouTube, he's got a really good channel. I'd recommend it to people. He put out a video earlier this year. I want to say it was called like What Really Caused World War II. And he did an excellent job of making the dichotomy all the way back to the Russian Revolution of the fear of communism, which we focus on as the Cold War phenomena, but we forget was a major theme, as you've kind of pointed out today, between 1918 and 1940. In fact, it was really the theme that led to the rise of then right-wing nationalism, be it the Nazis, be it the fascists, the fascisti in Italy, and all that. So when you look at the fear that this puts into people, like obviously I'm not a fan of communism. I think it's pretty disastrous. I also think far right-wing, fascism is disastrous too. Like it seems to me that there's something in us that when we see something that we politically really don't like, we can't just be like, okay, we don't like that. We have to stoke such fear of it throughout history that then we end up creating the opposite of it, which then can cause problems every bit as big, if not bigger.
Yeah.
No?
Absolutely. And there was, apropos of that, there was a program, I think, on Netflix about the Cold War that's on at the moment. Have you seen that? I think
No, I haven't.
Turning Point, the Cold War, I think it's called.
I have not seen that. There was a Turning Point like 9/11 one. That was pretty good.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
It's really good, and it's like a 9-part series about the development of nuclear weapons and how it's
Whoa.
got completely out of control.
Let's put that on the list.
Yeah, put that on the list. It's actually really good, but you know, it really documents that, you know, the fear of you know, the Russians sort of caused the Americans to you know, get involved in things that they really shouldn't have done, such as, you know, obviously the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you know, the nuclear testing in the Pacific, and you know, that you know, there's not a good ending when you're involved in something like that.
No, there's not. And that's one of those things, like, I've always thought about that, us dropping the bombs. Like, I guess everything's hindsight 2020, and not to be too much of a Monday morning quarterback, but that always felt like a button, no pun intended, but a button you just don't press, right? Because luckily it didn't at the time, but that's the kind of thing that could lead to like a nuclear holocaust and all that. But
yeah, but what the makers of this program were essentially kind of trying to make very clear was that, you know, it's that butterfly effect. Okay, you drop a bomb in Japan, then you've got an invasion of Ukraine. You know, however many decades later, it's all interconnected. And
so they attacked that in that documentary.
Yeah, and it's very good. So, you know, yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, that's fascinating because it you're right. It really does. It shifts. I mean, you could go back to even like in America in our history, look at the Revolutionary War and some of the standards that and the immediate aftermath set still affect today. You know, and that's what, like 250 years ago, something like that. So it makes sense that the biggest war of our time, of period world history, World War II, which seems like a long time ago, coming up on like 80 years, it drew all these new borders that now we are dealing with today. In fact, as you just laid out, but both wars that are happening right now draw back to World War II and things that were drawn right after that.
Absolutely.
Crazy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So what was, you know, obviously you had your takeaway that Dick Ellis was treated unfairly here, but were there any broader takeaways about maybe anti-communism or, you know, the Soviet scare, things like that you thought there are other things that we need to reconsider about history and how people were treated? Maybe some people who, besides Dick Ellis, who were accused of things that perhaps didn't do it. Did you come across any evidence of that, or was it really just all focused on Dick?
Well, one big thing that I took out of doing this book was, you know, it's the tendency of modern journalism really to kind of, you know, rely on one source for a story. So, you know, the days of sort of going and sort of independently verifying something, and then verifying it again and then verifying it again before you publish are long gone. It's all just sort of incredibly reactive, and it's like, you know, let's publish this as quickly as possible. You know, this person's made this allegation. Okay, report that now. You know, put it online now.
Tweet it out.
Tweet it out, rather than make sure it's right. And I think, you know, Ellis was a victim of that, in that you had, you know, this sort of, you know, these 3 books in the 80s that came out, where his story was, you know, laid out and these accusations were made, basically formed the basis of every newspaper story that has ever been published about Dick Ellis ever since. Right? No one else has sort of gone and independently tried to verify kind of the claims that were being made. And it's like, and who were the sources for these claims being made in these books? You know, what were their motivations? What did they have to hide? You know, what was the veracity of what they were saying? You know, there were reasons, you know, for people to say certain things about Dick Ellis, maybe to cover their own asses or their own intelligence failures. So,
Yeah.
but I see this. This is the major problem. Like even with like you've got on the table there, Bond: The Last Highway, which is the book I wrote about the lead singer of ACDC, Bon Scott,
Yeah.
which took me 4 years. I mean, I've spent more time on that book than any other book that I've written, and that is about the last 3 years and the death of Bon Scott. And if you watch any ACDC documentary about the death of Bon Scott, or the story of the Back in Black album, it's that Bon died in the back of a car in London in 1980, that he'd had too much to drink, and that his mate Alistair Kinnear couldn't take him up the stairs, and Bon choked on his own vomit and died. That's the story. And then AC/DC triumphantly released Back in Black, that Bon had nothing to do with the lyrics on that song, and this is the greatest rock and roll story of all time, and this is the second biggest selling album of all time, and AC/DC a bunch of heroes. But the real story is very different.
How so?
Well, I spent a year and a half investigating Bon's death, right? Because the police never did it in the first place, and I did it, 40 years later, right? And found 2 witnesses who were there, who saw Bon with their own eyes, who said, "Oh, he took heroin," right? And that there wasn't one person back in East Dulwich with Bon in the back of the car. There were actually 4 people there. So this idea that one person couldn't carry Bon up to the flat because there was only one person there is completely false. There were 4 people. If there were 4 people, he could have been taken into the flat and he could have survived. He wouldn't have been in the car. It would have been found in the car, dead the next day. I don't know how much you know about this story, but
I don't know a ton.
But my point is, getting back to your original question, is that when this story gets told, the people who write the story, they never sort of research it themselves. They don't go and find their own information. They don't actually kind of trying to look at it from different angles or different explanations for what might have happened. And the thing was, having done it myself, I found that there was a completely different explanation for what happened that night. So I learned a lot from that, and and that was the same sort of diligence that I took into writing Pure Narco. Where Lewis can tell me all these incredibly wild stories, but I still have to go and verify them.
And how do you I mean, you can't verify all of them, as you said.
No.
But how do you verify much of anything besides going to other people who supposedly were witness to it?
Yeah, I mean that's
pretty much it, right?
Yeah, there's that. Yes, it's very difficult, obviously, in the drug world to sort of go and find people who are prepared to talk to you on the record about what happened or whatever. But there were always sort of traces of information in old criminal case files, in old newspaper reports or whatever, that helped me at least establish that when Lewis was telling me a story that he was there, in Medellin or Bogota at the time that he said he was there, and that these drug traffickers that he was involved with were alive at that time. Things like that. So you can't 100% verify something, beyond a doubt with a book like that, but you certainly do as much as you can, and you just sort of have to make a judgment call about whether it's true or not. And I never really got a feeling that he was, bullshitting me. And I said to him, look, if you lie to me at any point, forget it. I don't want to have anything to do with it. I cannot be a party to a load of bullshit.
You also don't want to write a novel that turns into some sort of hero's arc in some way for someone who wants to change the story.
No, but my point is that, you know, if you're going to connect with the reader, the way that you're going to connect is you have to be completely authentic and fearless, and be prepared to kind of, you know, face up to your own fuck ups and show some contrition. And like, we haven't talked about it, but like the second book that I wrote was a book about my marriage, the failure of my first marriage, and like my dating, and all the sort of the terrible kind of time that I had after the dissolution of my first marriage. But it was a very naked book, and it wasn't very flattering to me in any way. And I confessed things that, you know, most people would never sort of confess in a book. You know, like things that weren't really meant to be put on a page. But I went ahead and did it, and I put it in the book, and then, you know, people would write me letters and say, "Oh my God, man, I relate to that so much because finally, you know, someone's sort of talking about the same things that I've been going through." And
what kind of things?
Oh, I mean, I've had OCD for since my mid-20s.
Me too.
Yeah, have you? Okay, yeah. Which is a terrible thing for anyone to go through, and I don't think anyone sort of adequately sort of explains what it's like to live with OCD. And I had to sort of put that in the book. I didn't really want to, but it was kind of like, I felt like it was an explanation for my own behavior during that time. You know, I was very promiscuous. You know, I was dating all the time. I was, you know, sleeping with 3-4 girls a week or whatever at that time. But it was like, it was my way of dealing with that OCD. There was no other sort of explanation for it. And, you know, I mean, I don't know what kind of OCD you struggle with or whatever, but it's been something that I've been able to manage. But at that time of my life, when, you know, my life was falling apart, it was just very accentuated and very intense, and sex just became a release from that. So I had to document that in the book. I had to talk about my own struggle with OCD, and that's not something that I really wanted to kind of voluntarily do, but I felt like if I'm going to write a memoir, I have to do it as honestly as possible. And the only way that you're going to connect with a reader is that you have to, you know, take that leap of faith.
Yeah. And people can smell bullshit too.
And people can smell bullshit.
They can smell it.
But the thing is that to this day, even though, you know, Laid Bare it never got published outside of Australia. But to this day, it is still the book that I get the most letters from readers about, you know. Probably Bon Scott and Laid Bare. And I look back on that and I think, you know, yeah, I'm proud of that. That's
very cool.
That's what I should be doing as a writer. And, you know, I think I've taken that approach with all the books that I've written. And I do have a degree of, you know, empathy, I guess, for, you know, like for Bon Scott, for Louis Navia, and now for Dick Ellis. I mean, I think they're all kind of either misunderstood people or people who can't explain themselves. You know, they're just not able to explain themselves. But they've all got sort of unique stories that are worth sort of putting on paper. I think that's the sort of the common strand. But yeah, you know, Laid Bare was, you know, the book that probably I'm most proud of because it's the one that I was sort of given the opportunity to be the most personal.
Yeah, I think also in the era where we are currently facing, with social media focusing on this whole, I got this perfect life, look at me, look at what's happening, this is all good, I can selectively show you what I want. Most of the people who are posting those things, almost everyone at least inherently may know that like shit's not that good for them. Even if their life is okay, like it ain't like that. And there's this weird competitive thing that happens where you feel like you have to do that to show that your life is this so that, you know, you can look good to your friends or to people you don't fucking even know or care about. And so we have a higher degree of currency now, and there is more appreciation, righteously so, for people who are willing to be honest about stuff. Not in a way that's like weird, like shitting in public or something like that, but in a way that is just like, hey, this is the deal. This is my experience, for better or worse. Take it as you will. And by the way, maybe there's some things in there you could relate to. And maybe us talking about this out loud or doing something, in this case public, with you writing a book that people can refer to, that many people who don't know you can see, you can help someone out that way unknowingly. And it also, you know, and it sounds like this and how you're explaining it also helps yourself. It's pretty therapeutic for you.
Yeah, definitely therapeutic for me. And I mean, I always just, I'd just get really upset, you know, when, you know, someone would say, oh, I'm so OCD. You know, I rearrange things in my fridge, you know, or I do this in my sock drawer. And it's like, no, dude, that's not fucking OCD. That's not really the worst part of it. The worst part of it is these intrusive thoughts that you get. You know, I don't know if that's what you've been experiencing, or dealing with. But you know, for me, that's what was the hard part. It's like it's why these people do these compulsions, right? You don't really talk about these terrible things that are going on in your head. You can't stop them. There's no way you can, you know, stop this sort of terrible kind of process that you're going through. And I tried to sort of distract myself so many times, you know, just with drinking or sex or whatever I was going through at that time. And it's not very productive. It doesn't really get you anywhere. And then eventually you reach a point where it's like, okay, I just need to manage it. And I guess in some ways, someone asked me this years ago, said, you know, have you managed to kind of utilize your OCD in a sort of productive way with your writing? And yeah, I think I have. I'm very meticulous about research, you know, about getting everything right, about examining every possible document, or, you know, being just absolutely fastidious. So
You seem pretty obsessed with the truth too, which is good.
Yeah, but, you know, there's so much bullshit in the world. It's like, well, you know, for me, you know, the story of Bon Scott, I was very passionate about putting that out there because I felt like I was correcting this ridiculous myth that had sort of built up around not only him but the Back in Black album. And now with, you know, Dick Ellis, I feel like, hey, you know, if my hypothesis is true, with that Dick Ellis wasn't guilty of the things that he's been accused of, he was a remarkable man. He was one of the sort of the great men of Western intelligence in the 20th century.
Pioneer in many ways.
He deserves much more than he's been given credit for. Irrespective of all the allegations that were made of him sort of, you know, providing information to the Nazis or being a Soviet spy. It's like what he was involved with was really impressive. We should know about these people. I think it's terrible that, you know, people like that just get forgotten and neglected and it's sort of put into the too hard basket. So it was good for me to write this book because, you know, like I said, it started in the sort of at the beginning of the pandemic. I couldn't travel. You know, the Australian government made sure that we couldn't even leave the country for 2 years.
That shit was
I know,
crazy.
it was fucked up. And but you know, it was great for me in that, you know, I could get really stuck into it, and eventually it sort of became a bit of an obsession. You know, it was good for my OCD.
On that note, though, with living in Australia through this, do you, as an Australian, you're now living in the UK at the moment, but do you fear that like something like that could happen again? Because I wasn't there, obviously, but we were seeing the videos here in the United States, and it got, I would say, really bad here. in some places for sure. But like you described earlier, helicopters over the houses, cops knocking on your door saying, we saw your Facebook post. You know, has there been some sort of blowback that people are saying never again on that over there? Or is this still like,
Yeah,
you feel like this could happen again?
I think so. I think there's sort of a great mistrust, really, of institutions that we used to sort of venerate and sort of hold up. And I'm not saying I'm anti-government or anything like that at all. But when it was over, it was like, fuck, I'm never taking my freedom for granted again. Just my ability to travel. So, I mean, I don't know what happened in the United States, but whether the government said you couldn't go anywhere. But it's like, you know, where does the government get off telling us that we can't even leave?
Yeah.
You know? I don't
That's
want
where
to.
it's-
I don't want to be here. My fucking right as a human being is to leave.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if I want to leave, yeah, I'll take the risk. Yes, it might cost me tens of thousands of dollars to come home, but I still want to leave, and I couldn't do that, and I'm stuck for 2 years. Can't do anything. Can't even bloody go to a gym. Can't sit at a cafe table. And people are fighting over fucking toilet paper in Australian supermarkets. I don't know. Did you have the same thing in the United States?
I mean, we had
was
some
insane.
craziness. Don't get me wrong. We definitely did. It felt like, especially, like I remember watching these videos we're talking November 2021, when things here had started to slowly go a little bit more normal. And like, we're looking at Australia like, holy shit, that's like Mad Max Fury Road out there right now.
And particularly in Melbourne. Melbourne had it a lot worse than Sydney.
Why is that?
Well, because all the COVID rules were state-based rules. Premiers of individual Australian states could make up their own rules. And, obviously we're all thinking, what is the point of having a federation if all the states are just sort of making up their own rules about something as important as COVID? It's like, why are we all operating under different rules? It was, really terrible time. It was devastating to me, on a professional level, obviously with, having worked for 3 years, writing Pure Narco, and Pure Narco coming out at sort of the height of the pandemic. And I just thought to myself, never again. I'm just never going to take my freedom for granted. And so, when I got the opportunity, I got on a plane, went to Asia, and it's like, never looked back really.
You went to Asia?
Yeah, went to Asia.
Did you live there for a time?
I wouldn't say I lived there. I was a tourist, but I was just, shuttling between, Bali and Thailand and Vietnam and Japan
nice.
and, Sri Lanka, and just, using the opportunity to get out of Australia, which I'd been wanting to do for years.
And that's why you're still writing this book, the Dick Ellis book.
So, essentially I was working on the manuscript, staying in homestays and doing it on the road. You can do it with a laptop. And and obviously with a book like this, everyone's dead pretty much. There's no one really to interview, and I could do it sort of remotely. So it was something that was sort of easy to do on the road. And then now I'm engaged, and
Congratulations to you guys, by the way.
thank you very much.
Very exciting. And living in the UK.
Yeah, so I moved in with my beautiful fiance, and we're sort of building a new life together over there. So
That's awesome. Real quick, I gotta go to the bathroom.
No.
We'll be right back. We're gonna get to Louis Navia. All right, we're back. So you and I at the very beginning of this conversation touched on Louis Navia,
Yep.
who has been on this podcast I recorded with. But how did you first get in touch with him in the first place, being a guy from Australia, and he's this ex-cartel man of the world living out in Miami? What was the connection there?
I wrote the book on Bon Scott, and I went down to Miami in, God, what year was it? 2015. And I met a bunch of people down there. One of these people, I can't say who, after the book was released in 2017, they called me up and said, hey, I know this guy in Miami. We were sort of mates in the early 80s. He was a big time sort of cocaine trafficker. He wants to write a book. Would you talk to him? So really it all came out of the sort of the ACDC sort of connection. As these things do, It's just and literally I was sitting in my shorts and singlet back in Australia, sitting in my backyard, drinking coffee, WhatsApping with Lewis Navia. And when he first, contacted me, all I could see on my phone was a picture of John Belushi as the Blues Brothers. That was his
Profile picture.
Profile pic on his phone. But it was interesting, really, when we first started talking, because he was kind of testing me out.
Mm-hmm.
And, he was obviously unsure about whether I was the right guy to kind of work with. And he had actually been working with another writer. I won't say his name, but who had gone down to Miami on a magazine assignment for, you have a magazine called Harper's?
Yeah, Harper's Magazine.
Yeah, so they had commissioned a profile of Lewis Navia for their magazine. And this writer had gone down to Miami and, spent a week sort of hanging out with Lewis and meeting, the DEA agent Eric Kolbinski and Bob Harley from U.S. Customs to put together a profile of Lewis Navia for the magazine, but it had never come together. And he'd been working on it for a very long time. And this person was a client of an agent out in Hollywood. And Lewis was very disappointed that the project hadn't sort of come together, that this person hadn't written anything about him in all this time. And he said, I'm getting very frustrated with this because I feel like my story really would be a fantastic film or a TV series. And at the time, Narcos and Narcos Mexico was sort of the flavor of the month, and sort of American Made with Tom Cruise and all that.
Narcos was such a good
was very
show.
popular. Yeah, Narcos was great, and so Lewis started talking to me on WhatsApp, and we went back and forth for probably a couple of months before I thought, actually, you know what? He's actually got a really good story. And I had no issue whatsoever selling it to my publisher, Penguin, in Australia. They really loved the idea. And we just started working on it. And it was an interesting process because basically, every time he called me, I'd record the conversation, and there were some times where he was completely lucid. Other times he was, absolutely pissed. He'd been in a bar in Key West or something, and I just need to tell you this, while I still remember, and tell me this story about, some fucking terrible drug trafficker that he'd completely forgotten about, who had, chopped someone's head off or whatever. And
he was somehow still a good guy.
Yeah. I want this in the book, so make notes. And this is at 2:00 in the morning or whatever in Australia. So I had a big file of essentially voice notes and emails and, whatever he was sending me. And it was just like this massive collage of sort of things that I started putting together, which became Pure Narco. And the big challenge, obviously, when working with a guy like Lewis, who's he's very kind of scattergun kind of brain. It's like whatever he's thinking at the time, and then he can sort of go off on a tangent about something else. Is structure. What's the structure of his life? Putting together a timeline. Where were you at this particular time? Where were you studying? What was your first job? When did you meet this woman? Blah, 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 blah. Like putting all these things together. And then suddenly you're putting together the chronology of a man's life, which he never did himself. So he was always hammering me, get the timeline right, get the timeline right, get the timeline right. And that was the sort of biggest part of really getting the book right was figuring out when it all happened. And because obviously a lot of this information isn't on the public record. At the time, there was some footage of him actually being arrested in Miami, turning up at Fort Lauderdale Airport after being arrested in Venezuela, which was actually on YouTube, but for some reason it's no longer on YouTube. But there were headlines in the New York Times and Washington Post and
big deal.
Guardian. It was so it was obviously a big deal. So his story checked out. He was obviously who he said he was. And
you said you spent like a couple months talking with him before agreeing to do it.
Yes.
You had been able to at least broadly check out some things in that time period to be able to say, okay, we're going to find out all the stories, but the general idea is he really was this guy.
Yeah, but the biggest issue really was his family didn't really want him to do it.
Really?
No.
What was their reasoning?
I mean, I don't know. You spoke to Lewis, and I don't know if he talked much about his family, but they obviously had concerns for their own safety, and he had concerns for their safety. So, he didn't really even want to bring his family into the story, but
that's a part
the
of it.
family was the story.
Yeah.
It was like I said to Lewis, you can't sort of write this book about your time as a drug trafficker and being a normal guy, being the Mr. Magoo of cocaine, unless you kind of bring your family into the story. The fascinating thing is that you had this fucking crazy life while being Mr. Normal.
Yeah.
And your kids didn't even know that you were a mega cocaine trafficker, right? They had no idea. He was just dad to them.
Yeah.
It's like the Breaking Bad thing.
Yes.
That's what made Breaking Bad work. And it was the same thing with Pure Narco. I said, Lewis, unless we kind of talk about how this affected your family, there's no point doing it. One, because it's just not going to feel authentic, but two, people aren't going to relate to it.
That's exactly right.
And also, I think, the family is a fantastic vehicle for you to show some remorse and contrition and show your human side. Because if we don't do that, it's just like all these vignettes of craziness and violence. And after a while, it gets very boring.
That's exactly. I couldn't agree with you more. That's why you look at Godfather 1, Godfather 2, Goodfellas, movies like this. People relate to it because of the family aspects, and they're not just because it's like they can't relate to being. Most people can't relate to being the hardened gangster or something like that, but they can relate to your wife walking out on you, and the kids screaming, wondering what the hell's going on.
And that is interesting you say that because for me, the greatest sort of true crime book ever written was Wise Guy.
Pileggi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing that made that book work was really the story of the wife.
Yep.
Right? And so I met Lewis's wife in Miami and sat down with his kids and had dinner, and
Without him.
he was there.
Oh, he was there.
So his ex-wife, his kids, and we're just having a normal meal. And I'm thinking, I'm having a normal meal with a normal family, but this guy's a fucking big-time cocaine trafficker. This is just fucking weird. But this is what makes it fascinating, that these people can sort of exist among us and you would never know. And eventually sort of Lewis understood that. And so then began this sort of gradual process of sort of convincing his family to get involved with the book. His daughter didn't want to talk to me at all. His sister didn't want to talk to me. She was against the project. You know, there were people in Lewis's family who didn't want anything to do with it. His son was very supportive. He understood that it was a good thing for his father to do. So I had no issues with him, but it really wasn't until the end of the book that it was virtually finished that I even spoke to his daughter for the first time. And
why do you think she finally talked with you?
I guess she probably heard from her mother, from her brother, you know, that Jesse was an okay person to talk to, that you could trust him, you know, and that's a lot of what authors do is you're sort of gaining trust with people. It takes time. It's not it's not something you can just sort of do straight away. So that took years, and by the end of it, the family became a massive part of the story. And it's like, you know, can't even remember how many chapters are in Pure Narco, but it's like sort of 65 or some crazy amount of chapters, right? And a lot of them towards the end of the book are all about the family. It's like, you know, how can you keep a marriage together when you're living like this? When you have to just fucking leave a country at a moment's notice because you're about to get arrested by the federales or whatever. You know, it's like it's crazy. It's a crazy life. And do you have any guilt and remorse for putting your family through all this shit? Right?
Yeah.
You know, and I Lewis is still a friend of mine to this day. I only heard from him earlier today. Like, we still talk to each other.
Yeah, I feel like he calls you every day. Jesse, I have another story for you, man. No, sit down. You got to hear this one.
No, but he wants to do another book.
Of course he does. I think there's like 10 books in that guy.
And we were talking at one point about doing like a treatment for a TV show. He's got a lot of ideas. Which would all be fantastic. It just has to be handled by the right people. And, we did have some sort of interest from, TV production companies in the book, but, that just didn't work out the way we had hoped. And so, Lewis's big hope is obviously that, someone sort of picks up the book and sort of turns it into a TV series because it's a fucking crazy story. Well, but there's so many ways you could tell it.
Exactly. And to your point that you're making right now, like, if I could see it coming together just like from the outside of how a TV show or, some sort of miniseries or maybe even a movie would come together, it has to be told as the guy who has a wife and kids, and he and his wife have an interesting relationship for various reasons. He can lay out what that is, and then he happens to be a guy in the cartel. Not the guys in the cartel, and by the way, he has a wife and kids. Yeah. It has to lead with the thing that people like. That's why people like Tony Soprano too.
Exactly.
Because, here was a guy going through a midlife crisis who was talking to his shrink about it, and his kids were annoying him during puberty, but he happened to be in the mafia.
And that's what we remember from The Sopranos, right?
Stay with the mic if you don't mind.
Sorry. That's what we remember from The Sopranos.
Yeah.
Is the relationship that he had with his wife and his kids. Mm-hmm. And that's the ending of the show. He's with his family, right? It's all about family. So I said to Lewis at the beginning, I said, the family is absolutely critical to us doing this book properly and doing it well. And there's no point us doing it if we can't get that cooperation. So he worked on that, and eventually they came around. But, it wasn't easy.
Yeah. And for people out there who haven't heard the podcasts I did with him, can you just explain what Lewis's role was in the cartel? Because as we said already a couple times, it was quite unique.
Well, he describes himself as a transporter. The guy who does all the logistics, and a guy who never carried a gun, was never involved in the sort of the horrible side of the business, which was the killing obviously and the intimidation, but the guy who would get the money and go and buy the container ships or buy the planes and organise the pilots and everything else. So it's, he kind of. I think there's a line in the book where he says, I could have, sort of taken these skills and sort of, started a franchise with these
right.
kind of skills. Yes, they're business skills, and he was just very good at it. And as you probably know, he has a certain amount of charm.
Oh yeah,
he has an amount of charm, and he regards himself as a funny guy. And he still berates me for hey, there's not enough humor, or there wasn't enough humor in the book. But hey, Lewis, this is a pretty difficult kind of project for me to pull together. I can't sort of do all these things simultaneously. It has.
We can work that into the movie.
Yeah, but like I said before, there's so many different sort of ways you could go with the telling of this story. You could have a whole film about Operation Journey itself, which was the operation that took him down, and which involved Britain and the United States, and it was a big fucking takedown. Or you could like you said, just sort of concentrate on the family, which would be my preference. But in amongst all that were all these sort of crazy vignettes about life in the cartels, which were sort of stories that you don't really get in Narcos and all those sort of drug themed sort of films. It's very different to Sicario, for instance. It's a completely different story.
Yeah.
And very long. It's like a 600-page book. But when I was finished with it, I mean, we could have done another 600 pages.
Sure.
It was he's done so many things, and he's also had a life after the cartels too, which is another interesting story.
Yeah, he did. He ended up doing like 5 years in prison after cutting a deal. There was the whole he in some ways had permission to be able to share with the government on some of these guys. Like they were cool. Some people at least were cool with it, and then. The part that I would imagine no one's cool with from his old life is that he gets out from prison and ends up doing work with the government. Like he did some undercover stuff for them. Like the way he described it to me that I thought was pretty perfect is he's like, my whole life I'm either on team white or team black. I'm not on team gray. So once I got off team white and, joined team black, like that's it. And so, that's what I do. And that kind of goes to like the whole amoral thing I was getting at earlier. Like he just feels like, okay, well, they want me to go do something undercover. I'll do it. Even if that's guys who were in his old life that maybe, he doesn't want to fuck over or something. He's like, well, I play for this team now. So this is our job.
I think really at the end of the day, it's whatever gives him the most adrenaline.
Yeah, I think that's a good takeaway.
That's how I see Lewis. He's addicted to adrenaline.
Yeah.
And he just takes that attitude into everything that he does. Whether it's his personal life or, his time at the cartels or whatever he's up to today. It's all about having fun. He's like a little kid.
Yeah, that's exactly how I describe him.
And I admire that in some ways. Like I said to you just before the show, like just driving with him in Miami, he just decides to fucking do a U-turn in the middle of nowhere. And it's like, Lewis, what the fuck are you doing? Why not? Like who does that? I would never do it, but he's just got that outlaw mentality and he's just taken it into everything that he does. And that's what's fascinating because he has this outlaw mentality, but he's also trying to adjust to kind of normal life. And a normal paycheck. And he's not used to normal paychecks.
No. This is a guy who grew up well as well. It's not like he grew up poor or something like that. Like he grew up well. He went to Georgetown.
Yeah.
And ends up in this world. I think you're perfectly stated saying he's addicted to adrenaline.
Yeah. And his father was a super rich sort of sugar baron and, so he's been used to a certain lifestyle all his life, and then suddenly, boom, he come out of jail, and oh, I have to, do this kind of manual labor to get by. And he's living in Miami, which is one of the most expensive cities on earth.
Mm.
And I think he struggles with that. So obviously a big motivation of him wanting to do the book was, selling the movie rights.
Yeah.
Seeing it sort of made into a TV show or a film. And I understand that. And the book was written with that in mind. I wanted it to be as visual as possible. But I also didn't want it just to be a sort of empty, soulless little
That's right.
piece of entertainment, which glorified drug traffickers, because I don't think that's the right thing to do.
And that's also, it's a tough thing to wrestle with, because when all these guys, once they get out of prison, I wrestle with it in this job too, with some of the people that I end up bringing on here, but they all want to write a book. They all want their book to be made into a movie. They all want to take their old life, if they've fully left it behind, and monetize it, which in some ways I understand that, but it creates, obviously conflicts of interest sometimes with the truth and with what people's motivations may be in doing that, and with glorifying everything they did. And that's certainly something that, like, I'm always going back and forth on, like, okay, well, if I had a 15-year-old listening to this episode, I wouldn't want them thinking like, hey, maybe I should go do this, right? But at the same time, yeah, I'd love to see that they were entertained in doing it. But, also like me as a young teenager, like my favorite movies were all gangster movies. I didn't like want to be a gangster. So part of it's like, well, you should be able to separate it, but then not everyone does, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think Lewis has so many other books in him that would, be just as entertaining. But
anything specific come to mind with that? Like things that maybe you didn't get to talk about in the book? Pure Narco?
Well, I mean, you touched. I don't know exactly what Lewis told you in his interview, so I need to be careful kind of about what I'm talking about. But you said something about him flying off to do these missions. And,
yeah.
He's quite secretive about that, but he was obviously involved in something. And that wasn't something that I felt like we could sort of put in the book, because I didn't want to kind of jeopardize his own safety or sort of, compromise any sort of ongoing sort of investigations that were underway, or, also find myself a target for some people.
Sure.
And that was the other big thing was like, I don't want some guy from the cartels sort of hunting me down because Lewis described some guy as an orangutan or whatever. So, I literally had to. I remember that line. There was some sort of hairy guy in one of the cartels that he said, "Oh, he's a fucking orangutan," and and I was like, this guy might be dead, but his family's still alive, and they may take umbrage at the fact that you described him as a fucking orangutan.
And so they might be in the cartel.
Let's take that out. What's the advantage of leaving that line in?
No, but Jesse, that's what I think. That's what we have to write.
Yeah. So, so his safety, my safety were obviously paramount importance. Writing the book, and nothing's happened. Touch wood, hasn't caused any sort of issues for me or for him. He's still sort of living in Miami and, safe. His family's well. And, I think we did it very responsibly and sort of, our safety was, the number one priority.
Yeah, it's also a period piece at this point, too. Like when you went to write it even.
Yeah.
He had gone down in 2001. It had been a while. I think that helps with things. People die, people move on. Some of the players, obviously, most of the players are not the same from when he was in there. So it's like if he had written that book, worked on it in his jail cell and put it out in 06 or 07, it might be a different conversation.
Yeah, but even as recently as a few months ago, he was sending me a message saying, "Oh, look, this guy's just been released from prison. This guy doesn't like me.
He'll make him like him
I
again.
just wanted you to be aware that so and so has just been let out. And also when you lose 25 tons of cocaine,
It's not great.
who's going to forget it?
Yeah,
when
it's
it
a
was
lot
their
of coke.
cocaine,
Yeah.
right? So I don't think there's any sort of statute of limitations on revenge.
Yeah, and how many countries were working on that operation? What was it called?
12,
Operation
12 countries.
Operation what?
Journey.
Operation Journey. So that was down in Venezuela. This was like a standard kind of. He's figuring out the logistics of moving, in this case, 25 tons of blow.
He was in the Venezuelan jungle, preparing to ship out 25 tons of cocaine to Europe using container ships that he had purchased in Greece for the express purpose of moving that cocaine. So they owned the ships. The cartel owned the ships, so they could do their own welding and
Customize it.
customize these hulking rusty vessels for the sole purpose of moving cocaine into Europe, where obviously at the time they were getting a far better price for coke than they were in the United States. So that's where this cartel was particularly interested in moving their product. And unbeknownst to Luis Navia, he was being tracked in Venezuela by the DEA and by the British, by the US Customs, because he had touched a glass in a hotel in this shitty town in the middle of nowhere in Venezuela, and an agent who was following them had picked up the glass and got a fingerprint off the glass, and they'd run it through their records, and they had found an old traffic violation from Miami
There you go.
where they'd taken his prints. Right? So the guy that they couldn't recognize was suddenly Luis Navia, and they had their man.
They thought he was like the Greek or something.
Yeah, they
before
called
that,
him the
right?
Greek, right?
Yeah.
Because from his time in Athens purchasing the container ships that were used in the smuggle. So
Right.
the Greek suddenly had a name, and that was Luis Navia, and the funny thing was they got it from a traffic violation back in the 80s when he'd been pissed one night and been stopped by a cop,
Right.
for being drunk,
Yeah.
and ended up back at the police station and had his prints taken, and they still had those prints. So the lesson of that is don't drink and drive.
That's it. Maybe he'd still be out there. But so you had a chance to talk with all the main investigators who were against him. And I'm forgetting some of the names now, but a lot of these guys, like Bob Hartley's one of them, I think, right?
Bob Harley. Yeah.
Bob Harley. A lot of these guys are friends with him today.
Today.
What do they think of him? Obviously, like, he's entertaining and is fun to be around, and like his story's pretty wild. But like, they spent so many years trying to take him down. He was around all these dangerous people that they don't like with good cause, and horrible things happened that he was at least around and he was a part of. Like, how did they rectify the fact that they're really good friends with him today?
Yeah, good question. But I spent a night with Luis Navia and Eric Kolbinski, who was the DEA agent who took Luis back to Miami from Venezuela. One night in St. Petersburg. Those two together were just like old mates.
Yeah.
Absolutely getting hammered. And we passed a bar at one point where, this a set of drums had been set up on a stage, and there was no one in the bar, right? Like the band that was going to play that night hadn't started playing yet.
Tell me Luis started playing.
Yeah, fucking Lewis ran up onto the stage and started playing the drums in this pub, just doing the fucking the Who, out of nowhere, until he got ejected by the bouncer. And Eric thought it was the funniest thing in the world. We were in hysterics. And that's the kind of relationship they have. They're very good friends. And I think that's great. I think that sort of says a lot about not only Lewis, but, I think that's the whole point of the criminal justice system. You've got to give these people a second chance.
Yeah.
And he's shown that he deserves that chance.
Yes.
He's become a good man. He hasn't gone back into that business. He could very easily go back into that business.
Even now, you think?
Well, look at what's happening in Ecuador. It's like
what's happening in Ecuador.
Well, you should be looking at what's happening in Ecuador
with the government,
with the cocaine boom that's going on in Ecuador. Ecuador has become a massive.
Take note of this, Alessi. We need money.
Yeah,
Ecuador is becoming a massive coke.
It's becoming
center.
Well, it's becoming a coke state. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, and they're all coming. They're coming up with different ways of kind of moving cocaine, and the product's still being sold. Yes,
Stop snorting cocaine if you want to help Ecuador. It's a bad start to a title because that's in Bloomberg. Everyone on Wall Street's like, yeah, fuck that and fuck Ecuador.
I mean, basically, Ecuador's almost a failed state because of cocaine, right?
Oh, okay.
The funny thing was, not so long ago, Lewis was saying to me, keep an eye on Ecuador. Keep an eye on Ecuador. Something's happening here. It's getting out of control. But he said, if I ever went back into cocaine, which I would never do, but if I wanted to start again,
if I
were to start again, it would be very easy to be moving product out of Ecuador. And this was a long time ago, before all this shit started happening.
Wow.
There are cartel gangs, ambushing sort of live TV transmissions. You should look into it. It's out of control.
I want to do a podcast on this. I gotta some of these, just the titles of some of these articles right there. Galapagos Island gets pulled into Ecuador's drug trafficking violence. They're trafficking right to revolution, baby.
Yeah.
Wow.
So but the great thing with Lewis, he's very intelligent. He knows.
He's very smart.
He knows the subject. He knows what's going on. He stays abreast of all the kind of the issues and.
He knows a lot of geopolitical stuff going on.
He does.
He's very well read on that.
I think he would be a great asset to any government agency, whether it's American or from any other country that is interested in kind of dealing with the cocaine problem on its doorstep. Like Australia has a massive problem with cocaine. Britain has a massive problem with cocaine. Spain has a massive problem with cocaine. And it's starting to move into, the Far East to Japan and China and, Thailand.
What do you think of his idea to legalize it to solve a lot of these problems?
Yeah, I agree with it.
Yeah, I think there's an argument there for cocaine. Some of the other ones, I think it gets a little tougher, but be very interesting.
Yeah, I 100% totally agree with legalization.
Yeah, I had some interesting conversations with him at dinner where it got into like me asking him about some of that stuff. Like, don't you think you'd be like a hell of an asset? And he was very cagey about that. But
yeah,
I guess guys like that don't ever want to think of themselves in that way. But it'd be like he's the kind of guy. Like I said, he's a perfect creation of like a spy. He's so unassuming. He's very unintimidating, he's friendly with everyone, he's charming, he's unpredictable, he knows how to party, like he's all these different things. And I was thinking like, I've talked with some of the CIA guys, I'm like, man, they would like this dude.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think even if you weren't involved in like, sort of work as an asset, or I think just sort of as a consultant or as someone who could give lectures to governments about what it's like to work in this industry from the inside, so they can understand it better.
Yeah.
So they can intercept, the flow of cocaine into their own countries and do it better. Like Antwerp, Scandinavia, all these places in Europe that are suffering because of the flow of cocaine. Could benefit from talking to someone like Lewis.
Yeah.
And I think he's very keen to kind of offer up his services. He would love to do that. I'm sure he would really appreciate sort of, having to do the kind of the day job that he does, to pay his bills and sort of make use of the knowledge that he's acquired from all these decades working in the drug business.
Absolutely. When you were doing this book, obviously, like, you're writing about his time in there, which was a while ago, but did you have a chance to talk with, be it guys on the ground right now actively in cartels, or guys who are, deep embedded journalists covering cartels, or was it more like you were talking with Luis and the players within his story?
In terms of, the thing was, I had to be very careful to keep what we were doing a secret, because had it become common knowledge, within those circles that Lewis was working on a book, prospectively we could have been in some sort of danger.
Mm.
So no, I wasn't talking to kind of other journalists sort of working in the field or anything like that. I was obviously working with and talking to, officers and agents and all those guys from, the British, services who were sort of working on Operation Journey, because it all started with them. And
it started with the Brits?
With the Brits. And so that was... They were very supportive and they were very helpful, because they were literally like sending me, PowerPoint presentations about Operation Journey, things that they'd put together themselves, all their old photographs, all the photographs of, the major cocaine hauls had sort of come from agents themselves. So they were very supportive of that. But in terms of, talking to actual other cartel members, no. Not active current cartel members, but I did speak to or have communication with, people who were involved in the business in the past, and obviously one of them was his ex-girlfriend who was given another name in the book, and that's it. That's the other thing is that every person in that book who's mentioned was given a pseudonym.
Sure. Yeah.
We just had to do it.
Yeah, it makes sense.
And the amazing thing is neither Lewis nor myself have been caught out yet, giving their real names. So we're very careful about that.
Yeah, and that's probably a smart way to go from a safety perspective, for sure. But Lewis, when he was in there, he didn't have to deal with like this fentanyl stuff. Yeah. And things like that. And it was interesting talking with him. I think we talked some on camera about that as well, but I talked with him a lot off camera about, the quandary that would be. Because he's like, well, that's obviously quite literally poison and can kill someone in an instant. And when he was moving his product or merchandise, as he calls it, it was pure cocaine, which, certainly can kill someone if you do too much of it, but it's not like fentanyl. So... this is kind of a hypothetical question, but do you think that he would, if he were around today and active, he would feel differently about moving this stuff, knowing that some of it could be very deadly?
I don't think he would do it. I really don't. No, not a chance.
I think I agree with you. I mean, he looked at it as a business, but again, like, he also, like, enjoyed doing cocaine himself or whatever. And if he had a product that was, like, cocaine laced with fentanyl, I don't think he'd enjoy doing that. Well,
if his friends were dropping dead from doing cocaine with fentanyl, I don't think he would be involved in it.
Yeah.
The thing was, he and his friends were doing cocaine and having the time of their lives.
That's right.
Right? That was his attitude. It's like, hey, this is great shit. Why shouldn't I sell it?
Sex, drug, and rock and roll, baby.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. And that's his attitude. That's the way that he lives. That's what I said to you before about him being an adrenaline addict. That's what gave him his thrills. The other thrill was making money.
Mm-hmm.
He loves money. He constantly talks about money. And I can kind of understand it being in New York for a day. Fucking everything's so expensive here. It's like, I don't know how you guys live.
Yeah, you go to the city centers in America. That's just kind of how
It's
is
insane.
now.
It seems like
Yeah.
everything's doubled, like
Yeah.
in the space of a couple of years here.
Yeah, New York City, it's like, because I live in Hoboken here, everything goes up about 30-40% when I cross the path right there.
Right.
I mean, it's that drastic for sure.
Yeah, I was
Down to the drinks you order.
Yeah, absolutely. Like coffees for like an espresso for $6.
Espresso better be incredible. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, and they were fucking terrible. It's like
Yeah.
$6 for fucking disgusting espresso. So I don't know how you guys live. You got to pay rent and everything else. And,
Yeah, you pay fucking $4,000 for like a 2-foot box.
Yeah.
In New York right now.
And you go out for a couple of a couple of bowls of noodles and you got no change from $75.
That's right.
It's just fucking mad.
That's right. It's
So
a lot.
No wonder these people are involved in these sort of industries. It's easy money for them. And yes, there are risks, but what's the payoff?
Yeah.
So I think in answer to your question, no, I don't think Lewis would get involved in fentanyl. I think he is moral in that sense.
Yeah, it's very sad what's happening with that around the world and how quickly that's happening. That's got obviously insane geopolitical implications. You'd have a maybe reverse opium war in that case with something like that. But I got to get in some people to talk about it. My friend Tommy G has done some great documentary content on his channel about it, and it's really on YouTube. It's really eye-opening at how, not just how awful it is, but how on what a grand scale it exists within this country now, with people who are just addicted to fentanyl and then people who are dying the first time they take it. It's very, very scary.
Yeah. And the other issue, of course, is that, the drug war, the war on drugs, whatever you want to call it, I mean, employs a lot of people. As Lewis says in the book, if you legalized these drugs overnight, suddenly all these millions of people would be out without their pension
That's
plans,
right.
and they're being able to pay their mortgages, and your economy would collapse. And there's tens of millions of people sort of in this bureaucracy that keeps this drug war alive. So there's all these sort of elements to this story that are very complex. It's not an easy thing to kind of come up with a simple solution.
Oh, it's so hard. I agree. It's like when you have people, when you identify a problem in society or something right at the beginning, you then have to attack it. And to attack it, you have to ask for people's time and their expertise. And time and expertise means you have to compensate them with money. And once it's the double slippery slope. You either don't attack it and the problem gets way worse, or you attack it and maybe it gets a little better, but you now create a whole industry that means that it can only get a little bit better. It can't get all the way better because we still need jobs. And each person's like, well, as long as my job still exists, we'll be all right. So whatever we got to do to make that happen. You just laid out like that's exactly what the problem is. And we see it with homelessness in this country too. Joe Rogan's talked a ton about that. These people are in these cities making $300,000 a year to be the homeless coordinator. That's not someone who wants to solve that crisis, because then they won't exist and they won't have a job paying that amount of
and
money.
Lewis talks about that a lot in the book, that it's not in the interests of these drug agents to crack the case immediately, because if they do that, they're not going to have the next 20 years of their salary and their pension, and they won't be able to retire at 50 if it was all solved.
Yeah, you got to let it drag out a little bit,
Exactly. That's what essentially he was saying. So there's no vested interest in for these guys to solve it.
Do you think part of it's the cop needs the criminal and the criminal needs the cop?
Yeah,
There's just
absolutely.
some sort of game in there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's the older I get, the more I realize that exists in far more places than I realized.
Yeah, and I mean, America has a bloated government, just like the UK has a bloated government, just like Australia has a bloated government, and obviously what's happening politically in this country is reflective of there is a certain element of the population that doesn't believe that it's effective government.
Yep.
But that's a whole other story.
That's a whole other story. And what do they want to fix it with? Again, it goes like this. It doesn't end well when that happens. So I do worry about that. But Jesse, I'm going to be checking out the new book you just wrote. Laid it out today. We'll put the link in the description to The Eagle in the Mirror for everyone out there who want to check that out. We'll also have the links in the description for your book on Bon Scott from ACDC, as well as the one we just spent a lot of time talking about, Pure Narco on Luis, which this one I've read, and this one is fantastic. Highly, highly recommend. And I hope to see you also have like a second edition of this come out when they get the TV show on this made, because that definitely has to happen.
Yeah, thank you very much, and that would be the ideal outcome for both of us. Because I just think there's so much more to Lewis's story, and I think he's a natural for television.
Oh yeah, 100% agree. But
very charismatic guy.
Thank you so much for coming in, sir.
Thank you.
Great to talk with you, Alexis. Thank you for being here. Everybody else, you know what it is. Give it a thought. Get back to me. Peace. Thank you guys for watching the episode. Before you leave, please be sure to hit that subscribe button and smash that like button on the video. It's a huge help. And also, if you're over on Instagram, be sure to follow the show at Julian Dorey Podcast, or also on my personal page at Julian D. Dorey. Both links are in the description below. Finally, if you'd like to catch up on our latest episodes, use the Julian Dorey Podcast playlist link in the description below. Thank you.